welcome to our second session of this module that we are having on principles of scientific and academic writing for research publication purposes. It is a pleasure for me to introduce our guest speaker today, Caroline Brown. Caroline is a scientific and medical writer and editor and publishing consultant with 18 years of experience at Canada's two largest scientific publishing houses. In her current consulting work, she writes medical articles for Nature and the Canadian Medical Association Journal and edits journal articles, technical reports, and fact sheets for the public in various scientific fields. She teaches scientists how to write articles for journal publication, and her own training includes the Banff Scientific Communications course led by noted science popularizer Jay Ingram. She is an accredited editor in the life sciences through the Board of Editors in the Life Sciences and certified professionals editor through Editors in Canada. And she has also taught courses to Mexicans in Mexico. So she is very familiar with the issues that we face in writing in English for research publication purposes. Thank you very much, Caroline, for being here today. And then I will give you the floor.
Thanks, Arturo. I'm very happy to be here. And welcome to everybody. Arturo has told me a little bit about the background of the participants. I know most of you are master's and doctoral students, and some of you have published and some of you haven't, but I'll ask you more about that in a few minutes. So Arturo has told you about my background. And when I was working in publication offices for the Canadian Medical Association Publications and NRC Research Press, which is now Canadian Science Publishing, I was dealing with ethical issues often. I would say I had one every month, some kind of problem. So sometimes I feel like I've seen everything. And then something would happen that would totally new. I'd never seen it before. So there are many, many issues that can come up, and we have to deal with it. Now, I don't have time to introduce everybody because I'm trying to do a lot in 2 hours. Communicate, as I said, by reaction, raising your hand, or by chat. And I have a question to start off. Have you published a paper before? And if the answer is no, you don't say no, you say not yet. Because you will publish a paper, right? So please indicate in chat or by raising your hand. Have you published a paper? Not yet, but you're working on one. Have you published one paper? Have you published 2 papers? Okay, getting lots of answers here. Perfect. Okay. And my second question is, have you encountered any ethical issues? And we don't have time for the whole story, but what was the main problem? Was it concerning who's an author, research misconduct, plagiarism? Have you faced any ethical issues so far? Anybody have any ethical issues? No? So far, so good. So hopefully today I'll tell you about some that you should be aware of. Yes, writing according to the standards of the journal. That's something that you have to be very aware of. And we'll talk a lot about that today. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm hoping that today we'll be able to talk about a lot of the issues that you might encounter in future and that you will be prepared in case any of these happen to you. But there's always new ones, so I can't cover everything. Today, we're covering understanding copyright, which I believe in Spanish is derechos de autor. So that's, so you see why I don't speak Spanish. My accent is terrible. Copyright is an important concept that underlies many issues in ethics. So we'll talk about some of those issues. As well, we'll talk about the journal's instructions to authors. The journals always have some kind of instructions that you're supposed to follow. And it's because there are many issues that journals have encountered that they want to prevent in future. And we'll talk about these like authorship, conflict of interest, research in humans or animals, funding sources, acknowledgements, and so on. If we have time, I'm hoping I'll have time to talk to you about predatory publishers and predatory journals and what those are. And some things, ethical things that can happen after publication, and like corrections, errata, retractions. Today, we will not cover issues that are research ethics issues, such as research fraud, scientific misconduct. I'm dealing only with issues at the publication level, the stage of publication. However, obviously, sometimes scientific misconduct starts affecting the publication. So the important thing about copyright is that it's an international law. So it's a legal issue, and papers that you're publishing in a journal are considered intellectual property, is the term we use in law. That is, their property, just like your house or something, or your car or something you own. So in law, using intellectual property improperly is the same as stealing. It's basically on the same legal level as stealing a car. Okay. And so authors are often unaware of this, and they don't take it seriously enough because the laws in many countries are very strict about this, and it can affect your career if you accidentally or intentionally violate copyright law. So it's something to be aware of. First thing to understand is that when you write something, you automatically have copyright in what you wrote. And today it's very easy to prove that you're the writer because it's on your computer and you have a date on it when you wrote it. So it's important to understand that you automatically have copyright in anything you wrote. And if there's a group of authors, obviously they all have copyright in it. Then what happens when you publish your article in a journal? And this is a very interesting area that's evolving quickly. It's changing. So it's always good to understand what the copyright policy of each individual journal is. Some journals ask the author to transfer all the copyright to the journal so that you no longer have copyright and the copyright is owned by the journal. Some let the authors retain copyright, and I'll give you an example in a moment. Some journals ask for a license, so they don't take copyright, but they take some rights, for example, to publish the article in a journal, and they give you some other rights. Usually there's something on the website, or they send you a document during the publication process that tells you what your rights are. So you might have questions like, are you allowed to reproduce your paper later in another journal? Usually the answer is no, but there's some exceptions. I'll show you one. Or in a book later? Usually the answer is yes. These are some of the things you might want to know. Also, if you have tables and figures in your paper, are you allowed to reuse them in later papers? And again, you have to check this. So on the left, you will see I have something from the website of Nature because I write for Nature, so I know their rules, but the rules there have changed a few times. So currently they want a license to publish. They do not require authors to transfer the copyright of their published contributions for original research. Instead, authors give Springer Nature, which is the publisher, an exclusive license to publish, in return for which they can reuse their paper in future printed work without requiring permission from the publisher. So that's pretty good. They'll let you republish the work and so on. Okay. You don't have to ask for permission. But many journals will ask you to ask for permission or tell you you can't republish an article in another journal. So you should always check. So one thing I'd like you to do today while we're having the course today is go to the website. In addition to the screen where you're looking at my presentation, please open the website of a journal where you have published or you would like to publish in the future. Where would you like to publish your article? And I would like you to familiarize yourself with some of the ethical information on the website of the journal. Most journals have some information, Some very complete, some more limited, but they always have some information. So take a look at the website, open it now. What does the website say about who holds copyright? And if you open an article, does it indicate who holds copyright? It's often the C in a circle, who holds copyright on the article. So just take a look now and share with using your hand in the air or a chat what you see on the particular journal's website about copyright. If it doesn't have anything, well, sometimes that happens. Some journals don't tell you about copyright until you get involved in submitting your article. So has anybody found something on the website of the journal? For those of you who just came in, I'm asking you to take a look at the website of a journal. Oh dear, somebody's browser crashed. Take a look at the website of a journal where you have already published a paper or where you would like to publish a paper in the future, just to familiarize yourself with the journal website and understand what it says about copyright. Does it say who holds copyright to articles published in the journal? And I've given the example of what is on the Nature website on the left of your screen. You're looking for something like that. It might say copyright, it might say license, it might say rights.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I want to publish in engineering structures,
Right.
and in their page, there is a part where they present their copyrights, author rights, for example. As an author, you or your employer or institution have certain rights to reuse your work, and they put a section where there is more information.
Perfect. That's exactly the kind of section you should find to inform yourself of what is which rights, let's put it this way, the journal takes and which rights you retain. So Cesar has found a section called Rights and Permissions on the journal he's looking at. Aira, am I pronouncing your name right? Found on Nature Communications. You are the copyright holders of your article and grant to any third party in advance and in perpetuity the right to use, reproduce, or disseminate your article. Oh, so that means that you are giving the journal a right to use your article forever. Okay, those are some good examples. If you have another one, please either put your hand up or there's, oh, Stephanie, did you have one?
Yes, Plus Genetics, they said under this open access license, you as the author agree that anyone can reuse your article content in whole or part of any purpose for free, even for commercial purpose.
Right, so that's PLOS, Public Library of Science, and they're very liberal. They're saying not only can you reuse your article, but anybody can. Now, I'm not totally sure, Stephanie, but I think PLOS has what's called a Creative Commons license. Does anybody else see anything about Creative Commons?
Not really.
Creative Commons you might see on some of the more kind of liberal journals like PLOS journals. And what it means is that as an author, you are allowing people to reuse part of your article. Okay. There is a website for Creative Commons that explains it more, and you can, oh, somebody has posted from Creative Commons. Okay. Emiliano has found one in the journal Futures. For articles published under the subscription model, authors transfer copyright to Elsevier, and they have Creative Commons. For open access article, authors will also have additional rights depending on the Creative Commons license that they select. That is, they're allowing the author to decide what rights they would give to readers. Okay, so this Creative Commons license sets out the rights that readers as well as authors have to reuse and share the article. See that? Okay, that's a very good example, Emiliano. Thank you. So that's what Creative Commons is. I don't have a lot of time. I want to move on, but I wanted to say, why is copyright important? Why do you think copyright is so important? Why are we talking about it? I'm starting with copyright. Very first thing. Why do you think? Why is it important? Exactly. Nick has understood it exactly. It's to protect the author. Okay. It's to protect both the journal and the author, but especially the author. If you have produced something, right, it's your property, and copyright prevents other people from reusing it without your permission or without permission of the journal, so that other people cannot claim that they, that their information, that they discovered something you discovered, or that they did work that you actually did. Because under copyright, if they steal your work, you can prosecute them. You can go to the police and say somebody stole this, right? And that does happen all the time, unfortunately, too often. Okay, so that is why copyright is so important. Let's move on. Okay, because of copyright, a practice called duplicate publication is one big ethical problem. So if you have a good paper to publish, journals want to be the first and usually the only journal to publish it. So this would cause a problem if you sent your paper to 2 journals at the same time. Okay, so suppose you sent your paper to 2 journals and one wrote back and said, oh yes, we really like it, just change a few things and then we're going to publish it. And while you're working on it, the other journal got back to you and says, oh, we really like the paper and we're going to publish it. So how would that cause a problem? Can you see, like, what would happen in that situation? Does anybody have an opinion? It would be a bad situation. Do we agree? Okay. It would be a bad situation for many, many reasons. First, if you had to withdraw the paper from one of those journals, they would be angry. They put effort into looking at your paper. They thought they were going to publish it. And now you're saying, oh no, I've decided on this other journal because I sent it to 2 journals at once. So they wouldn't like that. Okay. It's also possible that they might that the same article might be published by 2 journals. And I've actually seen this happen where somebody published the same article in 2 journals at the same time. So then who holds copyright? Suppose one journal takes a copyright transfer, and the other journal doesn't. Well, who owns the copyright? It's a big question at that point. In fact, the journal could say, this is a violation of copyright, and I'm going to sue the author, right? I'm going to get a lawyer and say that the author owes me money. Okay. So that would not be a good situation. So for all of these reasons, it is considered unethical to send your paper to 2 journals at the same time. So you should only send your paper, you should only submit your paper to 1 journal at a time. This does not apply to republication after you have published your paper in one place and you want to republish it in another journal or a book. So we just talked about you have to check and see what the copyright is. Who owns copyright? Are you allowed to republish your article? If you are allowed to republish it and you want to republish it, I would always, even if it's not required, I would always inform the new publisher that the article was previously published. And in the new publication, I would put somewhere, I would say somewhere that it was previously published in another journal. First, it's nice to do that. It's polite. But secondly, it tells the reader, this is not the first publication. This is not the original publication. It was already published. It's now a little bit old, actually. In everything about ethics, it's good to be transparent, just to tell everybody what's going on. If there's ever a question in your mind, should I tell people about this? Should I tell the editor? Should I tell the publisher? If you think maybe I should tell them, you should tell them, okay? If you're transparent and honest, that's the best policy. Now, there's a related issue. There's a related issue with it's not duplicate publication exactly. It's called salami science. It doesn't usually cause a problem with copyright, but it's still considered unethical. What you do is you've done one big study and you've cut it into several pieces that you publish separately. Many authors do this so that they can get more publications, right? More publications looks better on your curriculum vitae. You want a lot of publications. So it's not a violation of copyright because each article is different, but it's considered unethical because each journal thinks they're getting the full results of your research, but they're not. They're only getting a slice, just like a piece, right? So don't do this because the journal editors can get very angry if they find out, oh, they published a piece here and then they published another piece in that journal and another piece in that journal. And I've seen editors say, oh, this author is doing salami science and has published in 4 different journals, different pieces of the study. In fact, some journals will put you on a list of people they don't accept papers from anymore because they're so angry. However, sometimes if there's a very large study done over many years or with many different parts of the study, it's worth more than one paper. There's good reasons to divide it into more than one paper. So I've worked with authors who've had this situation. So they think it needs more than one paper because if they put it all in one paper, it'd be very, very long. So they suggest putting it in 2 or 3 papers. So what they do is when they send the paper, they tell the editor in the cover letter, talk more about cover letters in a moment, they tell the editor, this is one of 3 papers from this study. We propose to divide the study results into this part, and this part. Because the editor might be interested and might say, oh, I'd like to publish all 3 papers. We would be interested in seeing all of the papers from this study. It's a very interesting study, and we would like to publish them all. So that would be good, right? Then you would get 3 publications. So when you think it's worthwhile, do that. But in general, try to put all the results from a study in one paper. And again, sometimes you don't do this if the study is very long. If it's a long-term study over a decade, you might have several publications. And again, maybe you have to put it in several articles, okay? So use your judgment, but just inform the editors at all times of what you're doing. Okay, plagiarism. Can anybody tell me what plagiarism is? It's a big problem right now, that's for sure. What is it? Think in Spanish, plagio? It's the way it looks to me.
It's to take something that does not belongs to you and say that it's from your own imagination or authority, something like that.
Very good, Benjamin. Thank you. So, so exactly. And it's a violation of copyright because it's stealing from somebody else. So my next question, if you take 1 or 2 paragraphs from another paper and put it in your paper, is that plagiarism? Nick says, if you don't give credit, yes. Yeah, if you don't quote it, Cesar has had to correct his first chat. If you don't quote it, then it's plagiarism. That's true. So if you take a paragraph or 2 from another paper, you have to cite it, put a reference, where did it come from? And you have to quote it, right? Or it's plagiarism. Is writing a paragraph exactly like the original and citing it, is that plagiarism? So Nona says no. Anybody else?
I think it is. You have to paraphrase, I guess.
Okay, Stephanie, that's a very good point. Okay, so I asked you this because it's on the bubble, right? It's on the line between fair use and plagiarism. Yes, you have to quote or cite and or paraphrase. So if it's exactly like the original, that's called a verbatim quotation, right? And you should indicate that. How do you indicate that? How do you indicate it's a verbatim quotation, word for word from the original? Yes, quotation marks. Everybody's putting quotation marks, comillas. Exactly. Right. So if it is verbatim, the quotation marks, right? Perfect. And if it, several of you indicated, if it's not verbatim, then you have to paraphrase it, right? So that it's not exactly the same. Here's another situation that a lot of people who don't speak English as a first language do. You see some good words, like a nice sentence from another article, and you think, oh, that's a perfect way to explain something. And it's on a different subject, but I'm going to use the same structure of the sentence, but with different nouns and verbs. I'm talking about a different thing. I'm just copying the style of the sentence because I think it's a good way to express it in English. Is that plagiarism? I'll get back to your question, Angelina, in just a second. Anybody else? Is that plagiarism if you used some of the wording, like the structure of the sentence, but you used different nouns and verbs and it was on a different subject? Actually, it's not plagiarism. In fact, everybody does it all the time. Yes, there are structures that are common in scientific writing and are not considered plagiarism. If you just use the structure of the sentence and you're talking about a different subject, it's not plagiarism. Everybody does it. It's a good way to learn English. It's a good way to write well in English. And in fact, I do it. You know, I'm a professional writer. And if I see a sentence and I think, oh, that's really good, I'll copy it and keep it. And I'll use the same structure later on in my writing because I liked it. Okay. It's not plagiarism. You can do it. So Angelina had a really good question. I remember that once I read writing more than 10 identical words, even if you quote it, is not allowed. And no, you can quote even whole paragraphs from the original as long as they are in quotation marks and they are cited. The rule in, for those of you who are in social sciences or humanities, you can't quote an entire work. For example, a poem. Right? You can't quote the entire poem because it's an entire work. But if you can quote from other books and articles, you can quote like a whole paragraph and it's accepted as long as you clearly indicate that it's word for word from the other document. So why is plagiarism a problem? I think some of you have mentioned this. It's basically stealing from somebody else, right? And often it's basically trying to take credit for someone else's ideas. That's not very nice because credit is everything in academic writing, in science, social science. Being the first to say something, to discover something, to do a study, okay? That's so important. So if somebody else says that they did what you did, then that's really a problem. So there's problems with copyright, with plagiarism, trying to take credit for another person's ideas, and confusion in the journal record. Which ideas came from whom, when? Okay, normally when you do your literature review, you indicate how the ideas develop over time, different authors, different studies, right? But it would be confusing if two people said that they came up with the same thing and wrote similar articles, and one was the real one and one was plagiarized. So I have seen some terrible examples of plagiarism. Sometimes just a couple of paragraphs, what we call patchwork plagiarism, not as big a deal. But I did see one time an article that was about a spruce tree. This was a forestry article. It was almost exactly the same as another article about a different spruce tree. It was rewritten to be about another spruce tree. The peer reviewer recognized that the article had already been published. It even had the same figure, and it was submitted by authors from a different country. Okay, so this is obviously just trying to get a publication by stealing somebody else's article. And unfortunately, sometimes these are not recognized and they are published. And so then there's a big problem, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how that gets fixed after publication. Nonus.
Good morning. So I just have a question about this point of using some good wording from another article. So that you mean it can be done, but more like on a structural level, like grammatical, not taking the idea, but just the way to write it?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. And that's okay. Everybody, that's how we learn language, actually. Right.
Okay. Yeah,
And
but I mean, what you're taking is the structure, right? Not the idea. That would be plagiarism.
Right. Now, a lot of people make a bit of an exception for the methods section. Okay. Methods, often there are standard methods like that people use in laboratories or something to prepare something. And so in a science paper, in the methods section, often there's only 2 or 3 ways you can explain a standard method. As long as you cite it, if the language is very close to previous publications, it's okay. Welcome. Arturo.
Sorry, I just want to say, Caroline, It happened to me recently. I submitted a paper to my area is in linguistics. I submitted a paper in language testing, and they asked me, like, before you submit your paper, you have to have like a proof of plagiarism. So I was actually I had to and they say like you can use authenticate.
Yes.
I can't remember the other two, but authenticate charges you like, I don't know if it was $100 or how much money I had to pay to get a proof of non-plagiarism. I used the cheapest ones. The cheapest one. I can't remember which was, but they actually told me like you have these three options. So I had to pay for this proof of non-plagiarism, and they tell you like you're only allowed to, I don't know what was, like 10% of the total of your paper that can be, sort of similar, because obviously you are using in the literature review references and so on and so forth. That was something very new that I've never seen before, that actually the publisher is asking me to do this, because it's an open access journal, and then they asked me to do that. Is that something happening more often?
Okay, I've never heard that before. That's a new one.
Yeah.
It's usually, so these services, like the best known one is Authenticate, and it's the best one actually. It's usually the publisher that pays like a flat fee for the year to use this service, and they upload their articles, and it compares it with many articles across the internet and finds areas of similarity. Most articles have areas of similarity with other articles. So you just check and say, oh, yes, it's cited, it's quoted, it's cited, it's methods. It's okay, right? So journals do that generally routinely to find plagiarism, okay? And it's usually no problem. If it's quite similar, it's no problem. I've never heard a guideline like 10% or something. Because if 10% is citation, quotations from other articles, it's going to be 10% similar. It doesn't mean anything. If you've quoted it correctly, cited it correctly, it should be acceptable, right? So I haven't heard of them doing that. And this sounds to me like this journal is not very, I would say, not very ethical, because it's making the author do something that the journal should be doing. Okay?
I think they do that because it's an open access. So right. I don't know if that was a reason behind, because otherwise they charge for readers to have access to the research articles.
Yeah, they're trying to cut their costs. Many journals now also ask the author to have the paper edited for English. And that's again something that the journal should be doing. And it's making the author do it to cut their costs at the journal. So I don't like it. I don't think that sounds ethical to me, but so that's a new one.
Yeah.
I'll look out and see if it's a trend, okay, a tendency. Okay. Next topic is reproducing tables and figures. Okay. You have published a paper with table and figures. You would like to use the same table and maybe a figure in another paper. Can you do this? What do you think? I think we've already talked about the answer, so most of you should be aware of the answer. Got some answers here. Yes, if you mention the source. It's your own table and figure, and you want to use it again in another paper. Can you? Anybody have a different point of view? Eduardo says no. Noni says yes, I think. Cesar says yes. Okay, some confusion. This is one of the most common situations that you will face. For example, the data, for example, you may have data from a database. The data belongs to the authors, okay? But tables and figures from the data, the way of representing the data, belongs to whoever holds copyright in the article. So in the previous article that you published, if you hold copyright, then you can reproduce the tables and figures. Check that copyright statement. Are you allowed to reproduce tables and figures? It happens so often that most websites have something specifically about tables and figures, whether the authors are allowed to reproduce them. If the journal asked you to transfer copyright to the journal, and does not make an exception for tables and figures, then the tables and figures are owned by the journal, and you cannot reproduce them unless you get permission. And you can do that. So you check who holds copyright, who owns the copyright to the tables and figures according to the journal where you first published. So if they hold copyright, if the publisher holds copyright, you can ask for permission to reproduce them. They often allow you to do that. They usually don't charge you or anything. They say, yes, you can reproduce them. And they often have a condition, like you have to say that they are copyright the other journal, reproduced with permission, something like that. Okay. And you have to add that to like a footnote to the table or figures. This is something almost everybody does, and you have to be aware that you may not be allowed to reproduce tables and figures in other publications. I'm going to leave copyright now and talk about instructions to authors. So take a moment to look at that website of the journal that you looked up earlier, the one that you would like to publish in. And there will be something, we call them instructions to authors, but sometimes they're called author guidelines or guidelines for submission. There's various names for this section. There's usually a section on the website. And it's usually about, how do you submit, how do you use the online submission system, but it often has some ethical requirements as well. Things that forms you have to fill out to guarantee certain things. So take a look for a moment. What are some of the ethical requirements in the instructions? And share these through chat or through putting up your hand. Let us know what it says on the website that you're looking at. Okay, Emiliano has found a good one. Put it in chat. All authors, and we'll talk about this, all authors must disclose any financial and personal relationships with other people or organization that could inappropriately influence or bias their work. That's one thing he found. So, by the way, the first thing I'm trying to get you to do, and Carol has added an image file. Sorry, I can't open that, Carol. Can you cut and paste some of the wording? Just a few of the sentences, maybe. The first thing I'm trying to get you to do is always check the instructions to authors when you are thinking of submitting to a journal. Is that Carol?
Yeah, it's me. It's just a print screen of the website where is located guide for authors, so we can find information how to prepare our paper, like introduction before you begin, like ethics in publication, copyright that we talk about that, like how to prepare our article. It's related with reference, for example, or also what we should do after acceptance.
Perfect. So it's important to read this to know exactly what the expectations of the journal is. Many of the points may not apply to you, but occasionally something might. So Emiliano has found another one in the journal he's looking at, inclusive language. Inclusive language acknowledges diversity, conveys respect to all people, is sensitive to differences, promotes equal opportunities. Content should make no assumptions about the beliefs or commitments of any reader, contain nothing which might imply that one individual is superior to another, etc. Okay. Use inclusive language. Like in English, if a person does a job, we call them the same thing, whether it's a man or a woman, right? We don't assume that people are he, and he does not mean, like, we don't use he to mean the general case. We use their or they in the general case, even if it's just one person. We do a lot of things like that to be inclusive. So that's what that's about. Never assume things about people. Okay. Now I'm going to tell you about a cover letter. Okay. When you submit your paper, it's very important to write and upload a cover letter, which indicates several things. Usually in the cover letter, I also put in the objective of the paper so that the editors know quickly what the paper is about. And I also indicate that the authors have met all of the ethical requirements in the instructions to authors, and I write them all out. We used inclusive language. We ensured that no authors have a conflict of interest. And the contributions of the authors were this. And I put this all in a letter that goes with the article. Okay. A cover letter makes you look professional. It makes you look like you know what you're doing. And when an editor gets a cover letter from an author that says, we did this, we did this, we did this, they go, this is an author that knows what they're doing. I don't have to worry about this author. They're very good. Okay. So it looks professional to write a cover letter guaranteeing that you have met the ethical requirements of the journal. Aside from tables and figures, this is the biggest issue that we face that I see all the time. So this is a famous comic by Jorge Cham from 2005 about the author list. It's meant to be humorous, okay? But it's really close to reality. The first author, senior grad student, that would be postgrado, on the project who made the figures. The second author, grad student in the lab, who has nothing to do with this project, but was included because he or she hung around the group meetings, usually for the food. The third author is the first year student who actually did the experiments, performed the analysis, and wrote the whole paper. Thinks being third author is fair. The middle authors, author names nobody really reads, reserved for undergrads and technical staff. The second to last author, ambitious assistant professor or postdoc who instigated the paper, that is, who had the idea for the paper, suggested that you do this research, okay? The last author, the head honcho, it's usually the head of the research group or the laboratory, has not even read the paper, but hey, he got the funding and his famous name will get the paper accepted. Too close to reality. So this raises the question of who should be an author and why. You will notice in the instructions to authors that your journal or your publisher may have guidelines on who should be an author. Many journals ask about the role of each author. Another issue is what order the author should be in. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these. You'll notice I have some links here. The international, these are good for anybody, for any journal, even though they're the first one is specific to medical journals, but it's really of interest to anybody. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors has a page on defining the role of authors and contributors, and this is worth reading. The Committee on Publication Ethics also has a page on authorship and what they call contributorship, okay? Because in a lot of cases, the person is not whose name is in the list is not an author. They didn't write it, but they contributed enough that their name should be there. So many people expand the idea of authorship to contributorship, especially in a big study, a scientific study with a lot of different aspects. You may have a lot of people who played a role, and at a certain point, they should be authors. Okay. So these are the big issues in authorship. Before I move on, just a second. Before I move on, what do you think? Who do you think should be an author? And you can refer to this comic, the author list. Do you think some of these people should not be authors on an article? And do you think, or the opposite, do you think strongly that some people should always be an author? What do you think? Any ideas?
I think it would depend of the definition of author, but I think maybe author is the one who writes it and all the others are contributors.
But they all get on the author list, the list of, let's say, authors and contributors.
I have a question. I think that the first author is like the most important person in the whole project. However, does mean anything if someone is second or third author, or it's the same?
Good question. And we'll discuss that more in just a moment. Okay.
All right.
So Stephanie has made a point about the comic. The third author here, the first year student who actually did the experiments, performed the analysis, wrote the whole paper, okay, should be the first author. We agree, right? Everybody who is talking recently would agree with that. So Alina has said the second author, grad student in the lab who has nothing to do with the project, should not be an author. Obviously not. Okay, what about the second to last author? Ambitious assistant professor or postdoc who instigated the paper. So Aira says this, I think everyone should get involved, even if it's just a little bit. So this is a difficult one. Here you have somebody, it just says that they suggested the paper. Just a second, I probably got a sneeze coming up. I get allergies. The second to last author suggested the paper or the research or something like that. By convention, they're usually an author, but I agree that should not be enough. Just suggesting the paper or has the idea. They should also be involved in the research somehow. Just to suggest it is probably not good enough. Arturo.
Sorry, maybe some of these people, like for example, the ones that give the idea, they could be like, they could go to the acknowledgements, and then you can say that this person, thank you very much for the idea, or thank you very much for this other person who contributed by, doing the proof editing of the paper. I don't know if you should include all of them here, because if they didn't contribute with the project itself, I don't know. Now, one question: what happens in terms of? I see like project, like research articles, particularly when you are talking about astrophysics, nuclear physics. Like you have a list of 50 people, because even the technician that actually maybe turned on the computer and open the program where you are going to get the calculations, they are all included in a paper. So what happens in the hard sciences? Does it look better to have more people, because then your project looks more robust? Whereas in the social sciences, I actually saw very recently, I'm trying to submit another paper in another journal, and then they said usually there shouldn't be more than 2 authors. So in the humanities, they think that more than 2, it's not a good contribution. And whereas in the hard sciences, the more you have, maybe your project looks more robust. What do you think about that?
Okay, I'll get back to your question in just a second. Nonis, was that the same point that you were going to make? Okay. Exactly. Okay. And Emiliano has points out that sometimes authors specify who has contributed to the study, conception, and design, data collection, analysis, interpretation of results, and prepared the manuscript, actually wrote it. Okay. And we'll talk about that in a moment. A lot of journals are asking what the contribution of the authors is. Sometimes they even publish it. I definitely put it in the cover letter. Okay, Arturo's question. Is there like a number of authors that you can or should have? Okay, I'm going to make the question broader. And the answer is no. There should not be a minimum or a maximum. There's a lot of good papers where there's only 1 author or 2 authors, and that's fine. Those are the people involved. In these very, very big projects, what we call big science, right? Human Genome Project, etc. Sometimes you have 50 authors because all of those people contributed substantially. It would not be the person who turned on the computer or ran the equipment. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it would be somebody who actually worked, like the Human Genome Project, somebody who actually analyzed DNA data, and they had people working on it all over the world. So everybody who contributed to that was mentioned as an author. Sometimes in big physics or like these big science projects, big physics is one, big medical studies is another. They actually call it a group, right? They say the author is the such and such group, right? And then they have a footnote with the names of everybody in the group because it's too long. Okay, we can't fit all the authors on one page. So that's how you deal with that. But you probably none of you will probably get into that situation at this point in your career, but it might happen later. But these are for the very, very big projects that are done in like physics and biomedicine and things like that. Okay, let's get to some answers here. By consensus, if you look at some of those sources that I mentioned, an author should make a substantial contribution to a paper. So what is a substantial contribution? So some of the things Emiliano mentioned, they should, and these are an or, right? Like you could do one or the other. Like the original idea, by convention, those people are included. But I agree, they should do more than just contributing the idea, right? I was recently a co-author on a paper, and the person who contributed who came up with the idea and said we should do the paper, he was an author, But he also disagreed with how we were presenting the data, and he also gave some other sources, and he also suggested we move some things around. So he was involved. People who actually conduct the research, whether it's bibliographic research, like reviewing the literature, or working, doing the human or animal research, conducting the survey, feeding the animals, or laboratory research, the people who actually wrote the paper. Okay. So my major contribution to that last paper that I worked on was that I wrote the paper and I did the data analysis. Okay. So I was an author. In big studies, they might have a ghostwriter, somebody who writes the paper, but is not actually involved in the science, and they get an acknowledgement because they're just the writer. Okay. They didn't actually do any work. In my case, in the last paper I was on, I did both writing and data analysis. Okay. Data analysis or statistics usually is enough to be an author. Reviewed the paper for significant content. This is usually a supervisory role, like a tutor, somebody who goes through and says, oh no, you need to do this, you need to do that. Oh, we should take this out, we should put this in, we should change the scope. By convention, that person can be an author if it's more than just an internal peer review. They're actually directing the research, directing the preparation of the paper. Okay. So they can be an author. The head of the research group is generally given an authorship, but it shouldn't be like the case where they're just putting their name on it. That's called guest authorship or gift authorship. It shouldn't be like that. They should be fully involved, right? They should know what's going on. They should be interacting, giving advice, helping out, reading the paper, making suggestions. At that point, they can be an author. And exactly what we were talking about. If people make other contributions, you can give them an acknowledgement. So there's always a section at the end, acknowledgements, right? They ran the equipment. They provided an internal peer review. They provided the funding or the laboratory, for example. These kinds of things can be an acknowledgement. Those are just some examples. There's many others. So some journals do, exactly like Emiliano pointed out, ask about the contribution of each author. Sometimes they ask you to put it on the title page. Sometimes they ask for it in the cover letter. I would put it in the cover letter anyway. And sometimes it's a form you fill out while you're submitting the paper over the internet. Okay. So be prepared. It's a discussion that should be continuing throughout the research. Who is going to be an author? What are their contributions? You might even think, oh, this person is helping out. We should involve them more so that they can be an author, legitimate author. And you should keep notes on who did what to give to the journal. So you shouldn't decide this at the end. You should decide it during the research. Let's talk about another topic that came up, conflict of interest. I think that's the same thing in Spanish, right? It's called almost the same thing. So many journals are concerned about authors having a conflict of interest. This is also sometimes called competing interests, which means it's not as serious as a conflict of interest or might be indirect, okay? And here, the general rule is just to be transparent and tell the journal about anything that might be a conflict. It's not usually a problem, okay? So don't feel like, oh no, if I tell them about this situation, I won't publish my paper. Usually they don't care. They just want to know. They just want to know if you have any involvement that could cause a problem. Okay, so what do we mean by competing interests? Has an author accepted funding, a gift, or travel from a company? And often they don't just mean a company involved in the research, but any company in that area. Has the author done any paid work for a company working in the area? And again, it's not a problem. I mean, one time I was working with an agriculture researcher at UNAM, and a lot of agriculture companies were paying for the research. It wasn't a problem, but he had to tell them that the research is paid for by this company. Research funding or other support for research, like salaries, reimbursement of expenses from an organization, especially if it could gain or lose something because of the paper's publication. Like this agriculture company, it was trying a product. This was a study to test the product. So it you know, it stood to gain because it was a positive study that would show that the product worked well. So you have to mention it. Do the authors have any investments like stocks, shares in a company? Do they get consulting fees, or do they have patents or applications for patents with products related to the paper? Do the authors have any relationships with any organization or person in an organization involved in the paper? For example, is the author on the board of directors of a company? Is somebody involved in the company the author's niece or nephew or brother-in-law, right? So all of these situations are called competing interests because they don't necessarily mean it's a problem. It's just that the journal wants to know so that somebody else doesn't come along later and say, oh, you know, his brother-in-law runs that company. So he's always going to be positive about them. It doesn't matter if they're any good, right? They just want to know. So you report this, any potential conflicts, and you just mention it. Okay. Again, I would put it in the cover letter. Journals also have often a form to complete for each author asking if there's any conflict of interest. And the editors, if they see a conflict, they decide if any of them pose a problem in accepting the paper. Some journals actually publish the list of the competing interests with the paper. And in many cases, they won't reject the paper if there's something, they'll just publish it so that the reader is aware of that the brother-in-law runs the company. Okay, so that's how they deal with that. Any questions about that? Okay, now let's talk about research involving humans and animals. So research involving people must be approved by a body. We call it a research ethics board. Just in general, any body like this we call a research ethics board. But they're called different things, sometimes called bioethics committee, research ethics administration. I see different names, okay? And so the research should have been approved before it even started, right? By the board to make sure that the research is ethically conducted. Usually they ask for the plan for the research, the protocol, they look at it, they ask some questions, and then they say, yes, it's okay. Now, depending on the university, and I don't know the situation at UNAM, research involving animals may also be approved by a research ethics board, okay? If they require that. But oftentimes with animals, they just ask that you follow the animal care guidelines for the country where the research was conducted at the time of the research. This is important because animal care guidelines change, right? And they have become more strict over time. So it is the animal care guidelines that prevailed when the research was done and where the research was done that you should follow. And again, you should state this research approval and the animal care guidelines in the paper, usually in the methods section and in the cover letter. And again, it just looks professional. Some instructions for authors require it, but it just looks professional. It looks like you're a good author. You did things ethically. You know what you're doing. You know this is important. Okay. And we talked about acknowledgement. Journals often ask authors to indicate where they got their funding, how the research was paid for. They usually indicate this in the cover letter and in acknowledgements. Sometimes they ask for a special statement, like about the funding source, maybe on the title page. So look for that. They'll ask about the funding sources. Again, anybody who contributed to the research or paper but does not meet the criteria for authorship should be acknowledged. If a colleague or editor helped with English, they should be acknowledged. It's always okay to get help with language, right? I do a lot of this myself. And just be honest and state that somebody helped with the English, because the person who helped with the English, like, they're not responsible for the intellectual content. That's the authors, and they should get an acknowledgement unless they were involved in some other way that would make them an author. So always have a section for acknowledgements and make sure you acknowledge anybody associated with the paper. Now, I'm going to stop sharing.
But I don't remember the problem.
Okay. So group 1 had the problem with the long-term study of rodents in Mexican dry forest published 2 years ago, and you want to publish the same graphs with an additional 2 years of data. Okay. Who was that?
the problem was to use the graphic, and we came to the consensus. First of all, we need to review the rights and permissions or common creatives to use the graphic. We need to review in the journal.
Right.
And if we don't have a problem, we could create a new graph and cite the previous source of information. It can be our previous article or not, but we need to cite it. And clarifying what are the data of the previous source and what are our new data.
That would be a perfect response. Excellent. Thanks very much to group 1. Okay, group 2 was the group that was working on a paper about a discovery, and your supervisor submits it to a journal without telling you.
I think this is our group, but I think it was group 3, but it's okay. The problem was right what you've just said. We were working on a paper about an exciting discovery. While we are taking this course, our supervisor submits it to a journal without telling us, and he has included us as author, but we feel the paper needs some more work. So the first thing we would try to do is to solve the problem internally. So we would talk to him and tell him that we think some work missing, some work is missing, and we would propose to him to take advantage of the first reviewer's comments and to correct or to add that missing part with the second step of the submission. If he disagrees, so we would try to talk to mention the problem with the coordination of the study of the university, and ask them to help us with those correction. And if we don't have any answer or any positive answer from the coordination, and we would wait for the comments of the journals, or when the journals ask us our permission to publish the article. So we would mention that, yeah, we agree with the publication or the submission, but we would like to review as a team the journal and the authors, and to add that part that is missing. And if we get a positive answer from the journal, and the supervisor accepts the correction, we said that we wouldn't work with him anymore in future articles. And that's all.
Okay, that's a very good diplomatic solution. I like it. Okay, and in fact, this example happened at UNAM with somebody I was working at, and that's pretty much what happened. But we did have a talk to the supervisor, because all authors should agree that the paper is ready for submission before it's submitted. All authors should be in agreement. The paper's ready and we can submit it, right? So I made that point. I know the supervisor just submitted it because he was excited, right? But all authors have to agree. So your student also has to agree that the paper is ready for submission. So in future, please, include all authors in that discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Next problem. By the way, these are all real problems. So the other one is about the supervisor that does not include the student as an author. Which group was that?
Yeah, we discussed that. The first step is to contact your supervisor and ask for clarifications. I mean, you may or may not get an answer, but I think it's the right thing to do before taking other measures. So it could be that you might have a case for correction to the paper. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's already published, but I think, or it could be, there could be the possibility of contacting the editors of the journal and explaining them that you did the research for that particular paper that was published, but your name was not included. So I guess that in this case, you have to present some kind of evidence.
Exactly.
So that you conducted this research and at a time that was previous to the publication of the paper, and that you contributed, to the I don't know, maybe to the development of the research, or to the writing of the manuscripts and so on. There are also other alternatives, like maybe contacting or getting in touch with someone or some departments at your university, at your institutions that are responsible for handling like these kind of situations, and you might get advice. So it could be that you can change your supervisor, or that, I don't know, they can start like I don't know how to call it, like a review process of why the supervisor acted in that particular way. Well, of course, it's all about power relations inside the institution, but that could also affect the reputation of the supervisor. I mean, there's the possibility. And at the same time, you can contact, I don't know, a student organization. And I mean, in this way, you can put some pressure on the institutions or the supervisors. And you can even use social media. I mean, to kind of put some pressure on it. So yeah, I think there are different alternatives, but I would say that, well, like, of course, it depends on the situation. But I mean, it might be difficult for our master students, to be successful in these kind of situations.
Yes, the evidence is very important. So you keep all of the work that you did, and you would present that both to the journal, and if you have a center or some kind of office at the university that deals with these kinds of ethical problems, that's perfect. Sometimes people go to other professors to tell them what happened, or to the head of the department to file a formal complaint. And again, you have to have the evidence, put everything in writing. So the university itself would take action against the professor if they agreed with the student. But I would not use social media, because that can become very hot very fast. And it could end up backfiring on you, because you could get in trouble if there hasn't been an investigation yet, for example. So I would, stay away from social media is my advice on anything ethical. But everything else you said is like, I would totally agree. Okay. Then we have the situation with long-term research on seals, phokas. Which group was doing that?
Well, with this problem, we have a moral conflict because of the cruelty towards the animal. But we conclude that this suffering that they went through will not be in vain. We will finish this investigation, but we will make a statement about this practice, about the cruelty that they suffered. And in addition, we propose the use of new tracking practice or techniques for future investigations.
Great. So you're going to be transparent, and you're going to discuss the fact there was cruelty to the animals in the study. It was acceptable at the time, and like it was because it was under the animal care guidelines at the time, at the place, it's okay, but today it's not. So you could bring it up as a whole issue in the paper, something that you discuss in the paper, and definitely in the cover letter, to make sure that the editors understand that you understand the issue. And it could be very important for the paper. It could be a very good paper. So that's a great answer. I really, really like that one. So I'm just going to spend a last few minutes talking about a couple of other little issues that come up when you're submitting your paper or after publication. And the first one, I'm going to mention it just a little bit, and Karen Englander, who's presenting later on, will talk about it some more. And this is something called predatory publishers, because I know these predatory publishers, they target people from Mexico. I have seen it happen at UNAM. So you have to be aware. So what am I talking about? There are many journals now that are open access and charge authors a publication fee to publish. That's their business model. That's how they work, right? Many are real, like PLOS, the PLOS journals, but some are fraudulent. They do not have real editors, peer reviewers, and so on. They exist to steal your money. Okay. So how do you know if a publisher or a journal is predatory? I mean, you're there, you're trying to find a good journal for your article. You find several journals in your area. There's a good guide that I've put here from Walden University that's about how to identify a predatory or unethical publisher. Okay. There are also some lists of predatory publishers and journals. There's a famous one called Beall's List, and it's still online, but it was discontinued. It was a guy named Jeffrey Beall, I've met him several times, who had this list, but he stopped it at a certain point. He couldn't continue it. And so it's out of date. Okay. There's another one on openaccessjournal.com. It has both a list of good journals and a list of predatory journals. So I'm not going to get into how to identify them, but really, if you submit only to journals that you know well, that you read articles from and that you have cited from, you probably won't get stung by a predatory publisher. Okay, so basically submit to journals you know, not to journals that you're unfamiliar with. Okay, and that's really the best guideline I can give you to avoid this. But just so you're aware that some of these journals are actually frauds. Okay, corrections. Suppose your paper gets published, yay, and that you put on Facebook, okay? And then you notice that you made an error in the published paper, or that in editing the paper, the editors made an error in the paper, okay? So there's an error in the published paper. What do? You can contact the journal and ask for a correction. A correction to an error made by the author is often called a corrigendum, and a correction to an error made by the editors is often called an erratum. But basically, they're all just corrections, okay? So what they do is they find the part that's wrong and they correct it, and they may have a separate file that says there's a correction to this part of the paper, or they may correct it in the original paper. Then the HTML and PDF versions of the paper indicate that there's correction, and they may link to a separate file or include it in the file, okay? Include the correction in the file. So the final file may be a corrected version of the original, or it may be the original paper with a correction attached, okay? So that people can find the correction. Different journals do different things, but you can always correct something if it's an actual factual error in the published version. The other thing I should mention, I hope this never happens to you, is a retraction. So anybody familiar with retractions? Have you seen articles that have been retracted? Have you ever seen this word? Okay, I'll tell you a bit about retractions. So here's a typical situation where an author might retract a paper. After the paper appears, you try the experiment again several times, and you cannot reproduce the result. So you think, oh, I think maybe we were wrong. I think that our first experiment was erroneous, and we published it, but in fact, it was wrong. Okay. So you can't reproduce it. So this happened, for example, in the Canadian Journal of Chemistry. When I was working on that, there was a chemistry experiment that they couldn't reproduce, and the authors wrote to us saying, we want to retract the article. So what is a retraction? When an article is retracted, it's like it's withdrawn after publication. It's like we never should have published it, is basically what they're saying. Some journals remove the article completely from their website. Some journals leave it on the website, but indicate in the HTML and PDF versions that it has been retracted. And they'll actually, you see on the screen, the big red retracted sign. Sometimes that appears on all the pages so that you know the article has been retracted. So that's when an author decides to retract an article. Editors can also retract an article. For example, if they discover an article was plagiarized, or there was scientific misconduct involved in the article, and the data is incorrect, okay? So then the editors can retract it as well. What they usually do is it comes to their attention that there's a problem because somebody, usually some reader, writes to them and says, you know, I think I read this article somewhere else, or hey, that was my article and it's been plagiarized, or I work with this scientist and I think there is fraud at his in his experiments. So then the journal first will publish something called an expression of concern, just telling readers, okay, there might be a problem with this article, we're doing an investigation. And then they have to conduct an investigation and they go to the university and they find out what happened. And then they either say, no, the article is okay, we'll keep it, or they retract it. So the most famous retraction in history is the Lancet in England had to retract the article that linked vaccination with autism because the article was completely fraudulent. The data were made up by somebody who just believed it, didn't actually have any data. And it was the basis of a lot of anti-vaccination propaganda. And so it was retracted by the Lancet years after it was published. It was fully investigated and retracted. So an article can be found to be fraudulent years later and retracted. And retractions are big news because they mean that there was something wrong in the scientific record that people have been following, and it really needs to be corrected in everybody's mental framework and everybody's understanding of the science or the social science, right? So retractions are always very important. There's a very good blog called Retraction Watch, if you're interested, that talks about what papers are being retracted and why. Okay, so you can learn more about ethical issues. And I direct you to the Committee on Publication Ethics and the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. These are very good places to find out more about ethical issues in publications, and there are many others. So if you're interested in any of these, please follow up and read all about them, okay? Now, I don't have time for questions because I've run out of time, but I'm very glad that I did have time to finish all the points I wanted to make, and we had time to do the exercise, and everybody got in there and had some thoughts. So it's been really a pleasure meeting you all. I'm going to just stop sharing so I can say goodbye. It's been a real pleasure meeting you all, and I've had fun, and I hope you have too, and I hope I've given you a lot to think about. You know, it's a lot in 2 hours, right? It's a lot to cover. If you missed anything, please don't worry about it because we're going to post the recording of this session. I'm going to send Arturo my slides and you can ask for a copy of that. There are other websites to go to. There's instructions to authors to read. So there are many, many good sources on this if you missed something and you want to inform yourself further. Okay.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's really a very, very good presentation and to know about these ethical issues and concerns. Guys, remember on Monday, we will have the editor of a journal, Sue Starfield, and the session is at 5 o'clock because she's in Australia. I am not going to be here because it's 12 o'clock at night in South Africa, but my colleague who is in Mexico is gonna join you, okay? Thank you very much, Caroline, again, and everyone, and have a nice weekend, and see you next week.